This is part two of module 4, crimes against the person. This part we'll go over physical crimes, sex crimes, crimes in the home, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. Again, our source is the textbook Criminal Louisiana Revised Statutes, Title 14. Against the person, there are a number of physical crimes. The first one we'll discuss is battery, which is the unlawful application of force that actually and intentionally causes the touching of another person against his or her will. Battery involves this physical contact that causes some type of bodily injury or is offensive to the victim, no matter how slight. A battery is a completed assault, essentially, and the elements include when the actor touches or applies force to the victim, the actor's mental state was either to had an intent to injure or with criminal negligence, or in some states while committing some other type of unlawful act, and that a harm done be done to the victim in terms of bodily injury or offensive touching. Assault, on the other hand, is defined as an attempted battery. The intention to commit a battery and includes gestures or movements that threaten the victim. Assault is the intentional frightening of another person or conduct designed to frighten another person. It's the willful attempt or threat to inflict injury on a person and the apparent ability to do that, or an intentional display of force. The application of the force is not required in most states, but the intent to apply the force must be proven. There are three elements to assault, meaning that there is an attempt to batter someone, or the conduct is threatening, menacing, or otherwise designed to frighten a victim with the intent to commit a battery, or to frighten a victim that would reasonably cause a person to fear physical injury. Mayhem is another type of physical crime. This is an assault with an intent to maim. State laws vary on mayhem. Some define it by types of injuries, such as a limb is disabled or eyes are disabled, and some simply define it as a grievous bodily harm. Elements of mayhem include dismemberment, which is the severing of a body part, or disablement, which is the loss of use of a major body part, or disfiguring, which is alteration beyond normal appearance. And lastly, the intent to maim or disfigure. Robbery is another physical crime. This is the taking of property by the use of force or fear, where the property is taken either from the person of the victim or in the victim's immediate presence. The elements of robbery include the taking of property, meaning that the property is taken and carried away without consent, and for the purpose of stealing or permanently depriving the owner of possession of that property. The taking from a person, either from the person themselves or the person's immediate control, that there be an intent to deprive the owner either temporarily or permanently of the property, and that there be a use of force or fear within the act, the actual use of physical power or threats of bodily harm to the victim, family member, or others present. Armed robbery, of course, is a form of robbery through the use of a dangerous or a deadly weapon. Therefore, armed robbery is treated much more seriously. In terms of crimes against persons, there are a series of crimes categorized as sex crimes. Of course, primarily the most severe and violent is the crime of rape. Under the common law, rape was defined as the carnal knowledge of a woman forcibly and against her will. Under the common law, penetration was necessary, but emission was not. And under the common law, rape was considered a capital offense, but the burden was placed on the victim to prove the crime occurred. Modern definitions of rape vary from state to state, but in general, rape is committed under the following circumstances: that it be done forcibly, by some means or some specific form of deception, possibly. It can occur when the victim is asleep or unconscious, or the victim is not competent to give consent, such as they're under the influence of drugs, mentally disabled, or even their age. Rape is a general intent offense. The offender doesn't have to have specific intent to have non-consensual sex, only a state of mind regarding of the victim's consent. Statutes have generally addressed a male perpetrator and female victim scenarios, but there have been expansions under modern law to same sex, as well as female perpetrator and male victim cases. Rape is most underreported crime because victims are often fearful of testifying because of inherent attacks on their reputation, their personal habits, their race, and even their economic class. To combat this and to increase testifying on the part of victims, all 50 states in the District of Columbia and the federal laws include rape shield statutes, which is essentially denies a defendant the ability to victim related to the victim's sexual history, except with the sexual history between the victim and the defendant, if any exists. And it also extends to denying cross-examination. Statutory rape is generally considered to be sexual intercourse with a person 17 and under, regardless of consent. There's some variance by state in terms of age under statutory rape statutes. Spousal rape is the non-consensual sexual acts between a woman and her husband, her former husband, or long-term partner, and any unwanted, humiliating, and painful sexual activity. In some states, force is necessary to prove spousal rape occurred. In terms of rape, it's important to treat victims of the crime with dignity and respect. It's critical to be sensitive, compassionate, and respectful. It's important for law enforcement officials to recognize that a range of emotions can exist in a rape victim, from being subdued early on in the process to being very animated or agitated as the process goes on. It's a best practice for female officers to interview female victims when possible, and ensure that proper examination and collection of evidence occurs, including fingerprints, bodily fluids, etc., before the victim showers. It's important to have a family member or friend there to offer support to the victim, and important to provide resources to the victim as well in terms of counseling hotlines, counseling centers, and support groups. A syndrome that's common in rape cases is what's known as rape trauma syndrome. This is where the victim appears calm after an attack, but then they will begin to exhibit physical symptoms related to the attack in the form of headaches, fatigue, sleeplessness, and even a development of severe phobias. Another sex crime is child molestation. The statistics are alarming in this country that there are nearly 1 million registered sex offenders in this country, and about 10% of those sex offenders are unaccounted for. The definition of child molestation is the engagement in sexual conduct with a child, in most states under the age of 13. And this crime includes exposing the genitals to a child, having the child touch the offender's genitals, removing the child's clothing, taking nude photographs of the child, and having the child touch the offender or another child in an appropriate fashion. Child molestation is often undetected and unreported because there's a desire to protect the molester, because they're either a family member, a close family friend, a mentor, or some authority figure. There's feeling of fault on the part of the child, especially if they're taught to respect the person who is molesting them. There's fear of punishment. Children often have difficulty expressing themselves. And at times, unfortunately, the parent may not even seek an investigation into the criminal act. Recidivism is high in child molestation cases. Rates are reported as high as 24% in some parts of the state. A main issue is that when child molesters go to prison and they're released, they often move to communities where their history is unknown. But there's been some significant legislation to help address this occurrence. Notably, Megan's Law, which requires community notification by authorities when a convicted sex offender is released from prison, and Megan's Law has been adopted in all 50 states. The identities and residencies of sex offenders are entered into a database generally referred to as the sex offender register. Another law was Jacob's Law, which requires certain offenders to register with authorities where they live and work. And Jacob's Law in some form has been adopted in all 50 states. Other crimes against the person include crimes against the person in the home. Criminal abortion involves the act of feticide other than by legal abortion. Of course, we talked about it earlier, but some jurisdictions include fetuses in the definition of a person. If intent is present and the act is with malice, the perpetrator can be charged with feticide. You have this concept of transferred intent. The fetus was not the intended victim, but under transferred intent, it meets the mens rea requirement. So review the feticide and abortion sections in Chapter 8 for your own information. Another crime against persons in the home is child abuse, which is the intentional or neglectful physical or emotional injury imposed upon a child. And this includes sexual molestation. Over 670,000 children are victims of child abuse each year, and in all probability, millions more go unreported. In 80% of the cases, the parent is the perpetrator of the child abuse crime, either through a duty to care for, protect, and provide for the child. In child abuse cases, the other parent, the non-abuser, has the duty to intervene or could face criminal punishment themselves. The ranges of child abuse range from all the way from failure to supervise to extreme forms of physical abuse. There are 4 general types of child abuse. Number 1 is neglect, which means to deny a child proper nutrition, failure to enroll the child in school, leaving them alone, or residing in an unsanitary home. The second is physical abuse, which is, of course, hitting, striking, beating, or injuring the child by some type of direct force or indirect force with the intent to harm the child. The third type of abuse is sexual abuse, which includes, of course, rape and molestation. And then the fourth is emotional maltreatment, which is verbal abuse, incorporating things like berating the child's appearance, their intelligence, or overall disappointment in the child. Battered child syndrome is something to take into account. It's a condition suffered by children that are subjected to prolonged serious physical abuse. Clinical manifestations of battered child syndrome is that it could occur at any age, that medical findings conflict with explanations of injuries, or any particular history of physical injury. The psychiatric aspects of battered child syndrome include um, uh, often that the parent was abused as a child, that there be low intelligence and maturity levels on the part of the child and in terms of development, parental denial that the abuse is taking place, alcoholism in the home, increased sexual activity, unstable marriages, or even minor crimes on the part of the child. Spousal abuse is the long-term physical abuse by a man against his wife or a girlfriend, or you could have a female abuser as well. Issues include that the abused doesn't want to leave the relationship due to safety concerns. There may be some financial or emotional dependence on the abuser from the victim. Uh, within spousal abuse is what's known as the battered woman syndrome. In this, the um, the victim eventually takes some type of action against the abuser, violent action usually. And the battered woman syndrome is recognized defense in many states. For example, the victim of the abuse may feel like they had to kill the abuser or be killed themselves. Um, you talk about spousal abuse. There's this battering cycle that's been developed. In terms of the phases of spousal abuse and battering. It starts with building of tensions between the abuser and the victim, minor verbal or physical abuse, and when the victim is passive, they sit there and they take the abuse. Phase two is some type of acute battering incident. Acute meaning physical action by the abuser on the victim. And then phase three is generally the abuser regrets that the incident occurred. There's a promise to stop and they get the victim to stay. But unfortunately, the cycle just continues to repeat itself until, unfortunately, the victim is either seriously injured or killed. The victim turns on the abuser and kills the abuser, or the abuser goes to prison. Another crime against the person in the home is elder abuse. This is the abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation of elderly persons. This usually occurs in the home of the victim and is carried out either by the victim's spouse or their adult children, generally one of the male adult children. Reporting is made difficult because the victim is sometimes incapacitated and has a reliance on their caregivers, which is usually their family members. They have an inability to communicate what's going on. They don't have access to phones or other technology. They may not know who to contact in the case of abuse, and they may not want to report a family member if the family member is the abuser. Financial exploitation is the most common form of elder abuse, and this is done by the abuser taking advantage of the victim's memory loss, inability to organize and manage their own finances and assets. So the abuser will take over the finances and assets of the victim and exploit the victim. All right, let's further our discussion of crimes against the person and talk about false imprisonment and kidnapping. False imprisonment is knowingly and unlawfully restraining a person and substantially interfering with his or her liberty. The elements of false imprisonment include the act of unlawfully restraining a person so their liberty is interfered with, and that there's specific intent to restrain that person. Generally, statutes for the crime didn't exist until the model penal code was established, and it was punished as a misdemeanor unless there are aggravating circumstances. The defendant has to compel the victim to remain where he or she does not want to be, or remain or go where he or she doesn't want to go. Confinement is only needed. So there's no requirement that a threat or actual physical harm be undertaken. There's two lawful restraint categories for in terms of false imprisonment. The shopkeeper's rule allows the owner or manager of a store or a restaurant to restrain a person if the owner or manager has this reasonable belief that the customer has not paid a bill or has shoplifted an item. It's important that the restraint cannot last an inordinate amount of time and that no physical force can be used. There's also lawful restraint by law enforcement officials. And this occurs when a police officer lawfully detains or arrests the person. The imprisonment is not considered a crime. Unlawful detention or restraint, on the other hand, could result in false imprisonment charges against the officer or officers. Kidnapping, by definition, is the crime of seizing and taking away of a person by force or fraud, usually to hold that person prisoner to demand something of value from his or her family, an employer, or even the government. The focus is not on how far the victim was moved, but rather the change in the level of safety that the victim has experienced. It's usually committed in concert with or incidental to some other type of more violent crime. Incidentally, child abductions account for several 100,000 cases per year in terms of kidnapping, and they're usually done by a parent. So the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act was passed, which requires states to enforce child custody judgments by court in another state, as long as the judgment is consistent with the act itself. So in module 4, both parts 1 and 2, you learn to explain the difference between homicide and criminal homicide, define the concepts of voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, and first-degree murder. We took a look at the elements of the crimes of battery and assault. We learned to define the crime of robbery and related degrees of the crime, and identify the elements of the crimes of rape and related degrees of the crime.